People say that sometimes the smallest problems open the door to the biggest changes. That's exactly what happened to me last spring when a simple dripping tap brought someone into my life who reminded me that it's never too late to feel alive again. Before we begin, I'm wondering, where are you listening from today? What corner of the world has brought you to this story? I'd love to know, because what I'm about to share could happen anywhere, to anyone, at any age. Let me take you back to that April morning when everything began to shift. I was standing in my modest galley kitchen, staring at the faucet above the sink. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop echoed against the porcelain basin with a rhythm that had become almost meditative over the past few weeks. The morning sun filtered through the white curtains, casting gentle patterns across the worn linoleum floor. I'd just finished wiping down the counters. Not because they were particularly dirty, but because at 74 years old, I'd learned that idle hands have a way of making the mind wander to places I'd rather not visit. That persistent leak had been there for at least a month, maybe longer. Honestly, it hadn't bothered me much. But 2 days earlier, my granddaughter Sophie had stopped by with groceries and made a fuss about it. "Grandma Claire," she'd said, using that tone young people reserve for elderly relatives they think are stubborn, "there's a perfectly capable man living just 3 doors down who used to be a contractor. His name is Marcus. Just ask him to take a look." I hadn't spoken to Marcus in nearly half a year. Not from any animosity. We simply existed in our separate worlds on the same quiet street in the suburbs. He was 70, I'd heard, still working occasionally as a handyman, though he'd officially retired from construction. A widower like me. Tall, with silver-streaked dark hair, and the kind of deliberate movements that suggested someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands. So I gathered my courage and called him. He picked up after 3 rings, his voice warm and unhurried. "Of course, Claire," he said. "I can stop by Thursday afternoon if that works for you." Thursday arrived with clear skies. I heard his footsteps on my front walkway before I saw him, steady, confident. When I opened the door, he stood there with a weathered leather tool bag and an easy smile. He wore a gray Henley shirt with the sleeves pushed up and well-worn jeans that spoke of practicality over fashion. "Good afternoon," he said. "Still got that leak?" "Still dripping away," I replied, stepping aside to welcome him in. "Would you like some tea? Only if you're making it anyway and have a few minutes to spare." That was Marcus, never in a rush, always treating time like something to savor rather than spend. He got to work beneath the sink, sprawled on the floor with his knees bent, occasionally muttering observations to himself. I leaned against the opposite counter with my own cup of chamomile, watching him work in companionable silence. As his hands moved through the pipes and fittings, he talked. Nothing profound at first, just observations about the unusual cool spell we'd had, a funny incident at the hardware store, how his favorite brand of coffee had been discontinued. But beneath the surface conversation, I heard something else. The subtle notes of someone who, like me, had spent too many evenings in empty rooms with only memories for company. "You ever notice," he said from beneath the sink, "how things always seem to break right when you've finally gotten used to everything being calm?" I smiled to myself. Maybe that's life's way of keeping us from getting too comfortable. He chuckled, the sound warm. Or maybe it's reminding us we're still here, still part of the world. A comfortable pause settled between us, the kind that doesn't need filling with words. Eventually, he emerged from beneath the sink and dried his hands on a clean towel I'd set out. All finished. Nothing serious, just needed a new washer and a little adjustment. I turned the faucet handle. The water flowed smooth and silent. "No drip." "Thank you," I said, and my voice came out softer than I'd intended. Marcus didn't leave immediately. He stood in the center of my small kitchen, his gaze traveling around the room as though he were remembering something. Perhaps his own kitchen, perhaps a moment from decades past. Or maybe he was simply hesitant to return to his empty house. "I miss the noise," I found myself saying, surprised at my own honesty. The sounds of people moving through the house, conversation, even the chaos. The silence can be overwhelming sometimes. He looked at me with understanding in his eyes. "I know exactly what you mean. It wasn't romantic in that moment. It wasn't even particularly intimate. But there was a recognition between us. 2 people who'd been carrying invisible burdens, finally acknowledging them aloud. "Would you care to stay for lunch?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Marcus smiled, and something in his expression told me he'd been hoping I'd ask. Only if you'll let me contribute dessert next time. We sat at my small round dining table by the window, sharing sandwiches and conversation. We talked about music we'd loved when we were young, about books we'd read, about the small daily pleasures that make life worth living. At one point, he reached across to hand me a napkin, and his fingers brushed against mine. Neither of us pulled away quickly. That brief contact stayed with me all afternoon. There was nothing dramatic about it. No swelling music, no breathless declarations. Just two hands touching briefly in a kitchen that suddenly felt warmer than it had in years. When he finally stood to leave, he lingered at the door for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't embrace me or kiss me, just placed his hand gently on my shoulder. I noticed your front porch light was flickering the other night when I drove past, he said. I could stop by next week and take a look at it for you. I nodded, allowing myself a small smile. I'll make sure it's still flickering by then. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the spot where he'd stood. It was remarkable how something as ordinary as a leaky faucet had brought warmth back into a space I'd assumed had gone permanently cold. Perhaps things don't break by accident. Perhaps they're gentle invitations toward something waiting to be discovered, something deeper than plumbing. That night, after Marcus had gone home, I found myself standing in my kitchen longer than necessary. The faucet, now silent, seemed almost too quiet. I kept turning it on and off, not because I doubted his repair work, but because I'd grown accustomed to that steady drip. Funny how quickly we can go from tolerating an annoyance to missing it once it's gone. I suppose that's what happens when silence brings memories rushing back. Sleep eluded me that night. My bed felt vast and empty, and for the first time in years, that emptiness bothered me. I lay there thinking about Marcus. The careful way he moved, the way he'd looked at me without pity or condescension, making me feel seen rather than simply old. That brief brush of his fingers against mine had awakened something I'd thought was permanently dormant. Morning came gently, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains. I wrapped myself in my robe and padded barefoot to the kitchen, still caught in a haze of thoughts. I made coffee and sat at the table where we'd shared lunch the previous day. 2 coffee cups sat unwashed in the sink. I'd left them there intentionally. I don't know what possessed me, but I picked up my phone and dialed his number. Hello? His voice was warm, slightly amused. Hi, Marcus. It's Claire. I paused, suddenly uncertain. I was just wondering if you were serious about that porch light. I could hear the smile in his voice. Absolutely serious. Would you like me to come by this evening? Only if you're not busy. I'm not. How about I bring some of those blueberry scones from the bakery? I remember you mentioning you liked them. You remember that? I remember more than you might think. When he arrived that evening, he wasn't carrying his tool bag. Just a white bakery box tied with string and a small paper sack containing 2 glass bottles of ginger ale. My late husband David used to love ginger ale. Marcus couldn't have known that, but somehow the coincidence felt meaningful. We stood on the front porch as the sun began its descent, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. The porch light wasn't actually broken. Maybe it had flickered once, weeks ago, or maybe I'd imagined it entirely. Maybe I simply needed a reason for him to return. He didn't even pretend to examine it for long. Looks perfectly fine to me, he said with a knowing smile, then settled into one of the wicker chairs. We sat there in easy silence, sipping ginger ale and eating scones, watching the sky transform from blue to rose to deep purple. His knee touched mine once and neither of us moved away. You know, I said quietly. It's been a long time since someone just sat with me like this. Marcus turned to look at me, his face half illuminated by the porch light. It's been a long time since I've allowed myself to sit with someone. I really looked at him then. Truly looked. The lines on his face weren't harsh, just earned. His eyes, a warm hazel color, held a gentleness I hadn't seen in a man since David passed. My husband, I began, the words coming unbidden, used to sit out here with me on summer evenings. We didn't talk much. We just listened to the crickets and held hands. Marcus reached over and took my hand, not forcefully, not even deliberately. It was more like a quiet question. I let him hold it, and it felt natural, comfortable, like 2 pieces finally finding where they belonged. We didn't talk much after that. The evening drifted by in comfortable companionship. When it grew late, Marcus stood, still holding my hand loosely. I should probably head home, he said. You could stay a little longer if you'd like. He didn't answer immediately, just looked at me while his thumb moved slowly across the back of my hand. I felt that same flutter from the day before. I'd like that very much, he said softly. We went inside, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Marcus followed me to the living room. I lit a candle on the side table, perhaps silly, but the soft light made everything feel warmer, more intimate. He sat on the sofa and I sat beside him, closer than before. I don't know what this is, I said, barely above a whisper. Neither do I, he replied, leaning slightly toward me. But it doesn't feel wrong. No, I agreed, my voice catching slightly. It doesn't feel wrong at all. He didn't kiss me then. But he did pull me gently into an embrace, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was solid, reliable, safe. I didn't cry, though I could have. Not from sadness, but because something inside me was awakening, something I'd assumed had been buried with the previous chapter of my life. Marcus stayed that night, though not in my bedroom. I gave him a quilt for the sofa, and he joked that it smelled like lavender and old books. It smells like comfort, I told him. Before we said goodnight, I leaned down and kissed his forehead. Thank you for fixing more than just the faucet. His eyes met mine. Thank you for letting me try. I went to bed with a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with room temperature. It was the kind of warmth you only feel when someone truly sees you, not the version you present to the world, but the real, vulnerable, hopeful, flawed, beautiful version. I fell asleep to the sound of gentle snoring from the living room, and I smiled into my pillow. Perhaps something really had been repaired, not with tools and washers, but with presence, attention, and choice. A new beginning. The following morning arrived with soft golden light. I woke slowly, stretching beneath the covers, and for a moment I forgot I wasn't alone in the house. It was only when I heard the quiet sounds of movement from the kitchen that I remembered. Marcus. I sat up slowly, pulling my robe around my shoulders and running my fingers through my hair. There was something unexpectedly youthful about waking up knowing someone else was in the house, someone who'd chosen to be there. When I walked into the kitchen, I found him standing at the stove with 2 mugs of coffee already poured. He was barefoot, his hair slightly disheveled, looking comfortable and at home in my space. Good morning, he said without turning around. Didn't want to wake you. I hope you like your eggs scrambled. I stared at him, then at the eggs cooking gently in the pan. My heart gave a small flutter. It was such a simple scene, a man making breakfast. But it felt like something from a dream I hadn't known I'd been having. You didn't have to do that, I said. Stepping closer, he turned then, that slow, warm smile spreading across his face. I wanted to. We sat at the table and ate quietly, our knees occasionally touching. After breakfast, he insisted on washing the dishes. When he turned off the faucet, the now silent faucet, he leaned against the counter and looked at me. I like being here. Claire, he said softly. I like having you here, I replied truthfully. That afternoon, we sat on the porch again. I'd changed into a soft coral-colored dress, one I hadn't worn in over a year. Not because I didn't like it, but because I'd had no occasion to wear it, Marcus noticed. You look lovely, he said simply, and it didn't feel forced or awkward. It felt honest. I looked away, feeling warmth in my cheeks. It's just a dress. No, he said. It's you in the dress. That makes all the difference. That made me smile. Later, we walked down the street together, just to the corner mailbox and back. We passed neighbors who waved and smiled, and I realized suddenly what they might be thinking. But for once, I didn't care about appearances or assumptions. Back at the house, we sat close on the porch steps. I could feel something building between us. Not overwhelming or frightening, but gentle and inevitable. Like a tide you stop resisting. Do you ever feel, I asked quietly, like there's still a part of life waiting to be lived? Marcus turned to look at me. Every single day. I nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't expect this, Marcus. I didn't expect you. I thought that chapter of my life was permanently closed. I felt the same way, he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Until I showed up at your door with a tool bag. We both laughed, but his hand remained there, warm against my cheek. I leaned into it instinctively. His touch shifted then, slow and reverent, his fingers tracing along my jaw before his lips found mine. The kiss wasn't rushed or desperate. It was patient and tender, tasting of hope and loneliness and possibility all at once. I melted into it, my hands finding his shirt, fingers curling into the fabric. When the kiss ended, he rested his forehead against mine. "I've missed this," he whispered. "So have I," answered. That evening, we didn't make grand declarations or define what we were becoming. We simply shared dinner again, cooking side by side. I chopped vegetables while he stirred the sauce, bumping into each other deliberately and laughing like we were decades younger. After dinner, we settled on the sofa together. I curled up next to him, his arm around my shoulders, and we watched an old movie that neither of us could remember the title of. When I glanced over at him, seeing his profile in the flickering television light, I recognized something in his expression that mirrored my own feelings. This wasn't about recapturing youth or filling an empty void. It was about recognition. Two people who'd carried their losses, their stories, their solitude, and found unexpected understanding in each other. When it came time for him to leave that night, he held my hands and said, "Can I see you tomorrow?" "Yes," I said. "Please do," because I wasn't ready for it to end. Because for the first time in years, I'd begun to believe in new chapters. Over the following weeks, Marcus became a constant presence in my life. We fell into an easy rhythm, morning coffee together, afternoon walks, evenings on the porch or in the living room, just being together. We took our time with everything. There was no rush, no urgency. We were both old enough to know that the best things in life unfold slowly. One Saturday, we drove to the farmer's market downtown. We walked hand in hand through the stalls, and I heard someone whisper, "Is that Claire Henderson with Marcus from down the street?" I smiled to myself. Yes, it was. I'd been many things in my 74 years. A daughter, a wife, a mother, a widow, a quiet woman with a kind heart and too much silence. But now I was something else too. I was seen. I was wanted. I was awakened. Somewhere between a dripping faucet and a plate of shared scones, something inside me had been restored. Not by accident, but by grace, by courage, and by a man who'd knocked on my door with a tool bag and found a way to repair something far more important than old pipes. He'd reminded me what it felt like to be touched, understood, and cherished, even in the later chapters of life. And the best part? The best part was realizing that those later chapters could be just as rich, just as beautiful, just as full of possibility as any that had come before. Perhaps even more so, because now I understood the value of every moment, every touch, every shared silence. Love, I learned, doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't care about wrinkles or gray hair or how many years you've lived. It simply shows up when you least expect it, often in the most ordinary circumstances, and reminds you that your story isn't over yet. Marcus and I didn't have all the answers. We took things one day at a time, learning each other, building something new on the foundation of our individual pasts. Some days were harder than others. Some days the ghosts of our former lives felt close. But we faced those days together, and that made all the difference. 6 months after he first fixed my faucet, Marcus asked me a simple question as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Claire, would you like to go somewhere with me? Maybe that bed and breakfast up in the mountains you mentioned once?" I looked at him. This man who'd wandered into my life through the simple act of kindness, who'd reminded me I was still whole, still capable of joy and connection. "I would love that," I said, and I meant it, because sometimes the smallest leak leads to the greatest flood, not of water, but of life, love, and renewed purpose. Sometimes a dripping faucet is just the beginning of a story you never expected to live. And sometimes, at 74 years old, you discover that the heart doesn't retire, doesn't give up, doesn't stop hoping. It just waits for the right moment. The right person, the right gentle knock on the door.